Here on Sleepless Homo, we do soft science and slow storytelling for tired minds, using what bones, burial scars and old rituals can still tell us. If this kind of calm, factual dissent is your thing, you can like and subscribe so more sleepless people find it without algorithms shouting at them, and tell me how you're listening right now, in bed, driving, working, headphones, speakers, half asleep. There are timestamps if you drift off and want to return later. All right, let's continue, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now imagine this, not as a metaphor, but as a place with dirt under your feet. A person is told to stand up, to stop being visible, to stop being normal, not because they have discovered a new version of themselves, but because the group has decided that the old version is no longer acceptable to keep walking around the hearth. In many societies, what we later call rebirth begins like that. Not with insight, not with intention, but with a doorway that is not a door. A cave mouth that swallows light. A strip of forest that starts where the last footprint of the camp ends. A river that is shallow enough to cross, but cold enough to make you remember your body. A boundary that turns ordinary movement into an event. We like to imagine that transformation begins inside the mind because minds are private and polite. But the evidence from ritual theory and from the scattered physical traces of human behaviour suggests something simpler and more severe. The first step of change was often staged outside in a controlled geography, where you could be watched leaving and where you could not easily be watched living. Anthropologists noticed this pattern long before they argued about what it means. When Arnold van Gennep described rites of passage in the early 20th century of the Common Era, he was not primarily talking about emotions. He was describing structure, separation, then a middle period where the person is no longer what they were and not yet what they will be, then return. Victor Turner later sharpened the language of the middle as liminality, a threshold state, and he treated it as socially potent and psychologically unstable. But what matters for our purposes is something that is almost embarrassingly concrete. In a great many cases, the separation phase begins by removing a person from ordinary space. It begins with a walk. It begins with an escort. It begins with being taken to the edge of where daily life is allowed to happen. Thresholds are not decorative in these accounts. They are danger zones that can be managed. They are places where rules can be inverted without contaminating the rest of the group, because the inversion is kept over there. It is the same logic that makes people set aside a place for fire rather than lighting the whole shelter. Not because fire is symbolic, but because fire is powerful, and power needs boundaries if you want to keep living next to it. If you look across environments, you find the same geographical solutions repeating, because landscapes offer the same kinds of edges. Caves are an obvious one, because they are literal mouths in the earth. They concentrate darkness, echo and cold air. They also concentrate evidence, because humans leave things behind in caves, and those things can survive. Forest edges work differently. They are thresholds of visibility. In open country, you can see who is coming, who is leaving, and whether someone is alone. At the forest line, that changes. Rivers are thresholds of vulnerability. You cannot run well while crossing, you cannot carry everything easily, and your body temperature drops. Outskirts of settlements, even temporary ones, are thresholds of social attention. Inside, you are a person among people. Outside, you become a figure at a distance, and distance is an old tool for changing how a group relates to you. None of these places require a sophisticated symbolic system to function as a transition setting. Their primary feature is that they separate, they alter sensory conditions, they make you less reachable, they make you harder to protect, and that is the point. If a transformation is meant to be real, it is often made to cost something that can be seen. This is why separation so often begins with geography rather than with explicit symbolism. Symbols can be argued about. Places are harder to negotiate with. A river does not care what you believe. A cave does not adjust itself to your preferences. You can tell someone they're no longer a child or no longer a novice, but that statement stays fragile as long as the person remains in the same space, doing the same small routines, watched by the same faces. Change that is supposed to bind the group needs a clean cut. Removing someone from normal visibility creates that cut. It interrupts the ordinary feedback loops that keep identity stable. It also protects the group from the ambiguity of the person in transition. In many small-scale societies described by ethnographers, liminal individuals are handled with caution. They may be treated as vulnerable, dangerous, sacred, or simply not fully themselves. Those words vary across cultures, and it would be dishonest to pretend they all mean the same thing. But the structural logic is surprisingly consistent. A person in between categories is unpredictable. Unpredictability raises risk. So the group moves that unpredictability into a place where it can be supervised, contained, and eventually resolved. Archaeology, of course, cannot hear the instructions given at the edge of the camp. It cannot recover the exact fear in the throat or the exact promise made by an elder. We do not know for certain what people thought as they stepped across these boundaries. But archaeology can sometimes detect that a boundary mattered, because humans treated it differently from ordinary living space. One clue is patterned deposition, the deliberate placing of objects or remains at entrances, choke points, and margins. Another is restricted access, which can be inferred from the physical layout of a site and from the distribution of artifacts. Deep cave chambers, for example, are not visited accidentally. If you find repeated traces of human activity far from daylight, you can reasonably infer purposeful movement into a space that demanded effort and risk. Lighting studies add another layer. To reach deep chambers, you need fuel, planning, and time. That makes the act socially meaningful, even if we do not know the story attached to it. We also see boundaries in the organisation of activity areas. Tool-making debris clustering in one zone, food processing in another, pigment use in another, suggest that space was socially coded. Sometimes the coding is practical, sometimes it is the residue of rules. And rules, even when unspoken, leave geometry. Caves are the clearest archaeological threshold because they preserve so well, and because their architecture forces decisions. In parts of Upper Paleolithic Europe, deep cave contexts contain evidence of repeated human entry across long spans of time, and the activities inside are not identical to the ones at the mouth. Even when we do not focus on imagery, the mere fact of deliberate movement into the interior is informative. It implies a social reason strong enough to justify risk, discomfort, and coordination. Elsewhere, in southern Africa during the Middle Stone Age, caves and rock shelters preserve sequences where the same group returns again and again. But the patterning of materials within the shelter shifts in ways that suggest changing use of space. In some cases, pigments appear in contexts that are not obviously utilitarian. In others, we see curated items, unusual concentrations or placements that look deliberate rather than accidental. None of this forces a single interpretation. A cave can be a home, a workshop, a refuge, and a ritual setting at different times. Archaeology is rarely kind enough to give us only one answer, but it can show us that the boundary between inside and outside mattered as a repeated behavioural choice, and that choice is the beginning of any threshold logic. Forest edges and river crossings are harder, because open-air traces vanish easily. But even there, archaeology can sometimes pick up the faint signatures of transition zones. Repeated short-term camps placed at strategic points along routes especially near water, passes or ecotones where different environments meet, suggest planned movement and stage stopping. In later periods where preservation improves, we sometimes find alignments, pathways, or repeated deposition near water margins. And in ethnographic records, rivers and forest margins frequently appear as places where novices are taken, where name changes occur, where isolation is imposed, where rules loosen or tighten. We have to be careful here. Ethnography is not a time machine. It cannot be poured directly into prehistory. But it can show us what humans do with landscapes when they need to separate a person from ordinary life without building stone walls. They use what the world already provides. They choose edges because edges are efficient. The geography does part of the work for them. If you stand back from the details, a quiet pattern emerges. Major transitions tend to be managed like hazards. That does not mean they are always experienced as trauma. It means they are treated as socially consequential. A person who is changing status is temporarily out of alignment with the group's expectations. So the group changes their spatial relationship to the person first. It is a practical move disguised as ritual. Or perhaps ritual is what practical moves become when repeated for generations. Either way, the transformation begins with a forced departure from ordinary space. Not because people lacked inner life, but because inner life is not what keeps a group coordinated when stakes are high. The earliest doorway into rebirth was often a removal, a controlled disappearance, a walk away from the places where your old identity was reinforced every minute by routine. In that sense, the first technology of transformation was not a symbol or a story, but a boundary. And once you left the map of the camp, you entered something older than comfort. You are told to leave, not because you did something wrong, not because the land failed, but because the people who know you best have decided that staying near them, while you're in the middle of becoming something else, is the risky option. In small communities, the ordinary world is not a vague idea. It is a schedule of predictable bodies, predictable hands, predictable sharing. It is who sleeps close to the fire, who is trusted to carry a blade, who is allowed to touch food before it is divided. It is the quiet system that prevents accidents from becoming disasters. So when a life transition arrives, whether it is adulthood, marriage, mourning, leadership, or recovery from a breach, the group often begins with a move that seems harsh to modern minds: separation. Not a symbolic gesture, but a controlled cut. It is an insistence that you cannot be half inside and half outside at the same time, because half-states create confusion, and confusion is expensive when the margin for error is thin. We have a name for this pattern, because a scholar in the early 20th century tried to map it across cultures with unusual patience. In 1909, Arnold van Gennep described rites of passage as moving through three broad phases: separation, a middle interval, and reintegration. The usefulness of his model is not that it makes ritual sound elegant. It is that it makes ritual sound practical. Separation is the phase that forces a visible end to a previous status. It is the moment the group can point to and say, without needing philosophical language, that the old role is stopped. That matters because roles are not private preferences in small-scale societies. They are expectations that other people plan around. When you become a hunter, a spouse, an initiate, a caretaker, or an elder, others adjust their own risks accordingly. If the transition is left vague, then every interaction becomes a guess. Do you still share as a child shares, or are you now responsible as an adult is responsible? Do you still sleep among those you grew up with? Or are you now aligned with a different set of obligations? Without a clear boundary, the group is forced to negotiate everything in real time, and negotiation itself can become a kind of slow emergency. Comparative anthropology, especially work grounded in long field observation rather than quick description, shows how often separation begins with the interruption of ordinary cues. People are removed from daily routes and daily tasks. They may be taken from the centre of camp life to a margin, or from a margin to a place that is deliberately hard to reach. They may be prohibited from eating with others, or from eating certain foods at all, not because the food is magically dangerous, but because shared meals are one of the strongest engines of social continuity. They may be asked to stop speaking in familiar ways, sometimes through formal silence, sometimes through restricted topics, sometimes through avoidance rules that limit which relatives can be addressed directly. These are not decorative changes. They are ways of cutting the invisible threads that make a person feel continuous with the day before. They also reduce the chance that someone will slip back into an older role by reflex, because reflex is powerful. If you have spent years responding to certain faces and voices in certain ways, you can fall into these patterns without deciding to. Separation rearranges the stage so the old script becomes harder to perform. From the group's perspective, this forced interruption is a kind of safety mechanism. It prevents a situation that is more unstable than simple continuity, the half change. A person who is almost changed can trigger competing expectations. Some treat them as the old role, others treat them as the new role, and the person themselves may not yet know which performance is expected at any given moment. In environments where survival depends on coordination, ambiguity becomes a hazard. Trust is partly prediction. If you cannot predict someone's behaviour, you cannot plan your own. That is why separation often includes visible markers that cannot be misunderstood. Altered clothing, altered hair, altered access, altered space. In some societies, the initiate is dressed down rather than dressed up, stripped of ornaments, stripped of tools, stripped of anything that would imply full membership in the adult world, precisely because they are temporarily not that. In others, they are marked as set apart by paint, ash, or a distinctive covering, not to celebrate them, but to warn everyone that normal interaction rules do not apply. Even when we cannot read the full meaning, the recurring logic is recognizable. The group is stabilizing itself by making the in-between unmistakable. Archaeology, of course, cannot record a rule like do not speak the old name for 3 days, and it rarely preserves the small humiliations and privations that often accompany separation. We should be honest about that. What we can sometimes detect is the material footprint of interrupted routine, the sudden appearance of activity in marginal places, the clustering of short-term fires in locations that do not fit ordinary habitation patterns, the concentration of certain refuse types away from the main living surface, the repeated use of sheltered spaces that show little evidence of domestic life, but clear evidence of human presence. In some cases, stable isotope work can show brief dietary differences, though the resolution is often too coarse to map a short rite with confidence. In other cases, patterns of restricted access in caves or rock shelters, indicated by where artifacts and soot accumulate, can suggest that not everyone went everywhere, and that entry was controlled. When an area is used repeatedly but contains little domestic debris, little food processing waste, and instead shows traces of brief occupation, heat, pigment, or specialized activity, it raises the possibility of staged events rather than everyday living. None of this proves a rite of passage on its own, but it fits a broader human pattern in which separation begins with geography, with the decision to move someone out of ordinary circulation into a space where ordinary rules are suspended. There is also a deeper reason separation works, one that sits closer to cognition than to custom. Familiar cues anchor identity. The sight of a hearth at a certain angle, the smell of certain foods, the rhythm of morning tasks, the small jokes that pass between specific people. These are the scaffolding of who you are as lived experience. When that scaffolding is removed, the mind becomes more plastic, more open to new associations, and also more vulnerable. That vulnerability is not an accident. It can be used to reshape behaviour, to intensify learning, and to make the new role feel real, because it was earned under conditions of stress and attention. At the same time, the group benefits because the person is not drifting unpredictably through shared space while they are in that vulnerable state. The logic is almost blunt. If you must be destabilised in order to be remade, do it away from the centre of the system. Do it where mistakes harm fewer people, where the old role cannot be casually resumed, where the boundary itself tells everyone, including the person, that something has ended. This is why separation is often so uncompromising. It is meant to create a clean break that others can recognise even if the person resists. In many societies, the end of an old role is not left to internal choice because internal choice is not the point. The group must know, not hope, that the former status is over. If the old role continues to leak into the new one, the group is forced to carry two versions of the same person at once, and that is not just psychologically confusing. It can threaten the distribution of labour, the distribution of care, the distribution of authority, and the distribution of risk. A child who is treated as an adult too early may be exposed to hazards they cannot handle. An adult who is treated as a child too long can become a weak link in a dangerous task. A person who is no longer permitted a former intimacy, but still behaves as if they are, can trigger conflict that spreads wider than the original transition. Separation reduces these failures by making the boundary non-negotiable. The old role is ended publicly, and the person is temporarily removed from the normal economy of recognition. In that sense, separation is less about personal transformation and more about communal stability. It protects everyone from ambiguity, including the person who is being changed. And this is where the modern discomfort often enters. We want change to be gradual, gentle, privately chosen, and compatible with daily life. In many cases, that is a humane preference. But deep time suggests something harsher. When stakes are high and systems are fragile, partial change can be more destabilizing than no change at all. The person who has not changed remains predictable. The person who has changed fully can be integrated into new expectations. The person who is half changed forces everyone to improvise around them, and improvisation is costly. So separation became a mechanism that made change discreet, legible, and socially enforceable. It turned transition into an event with edges, not a slow blur. It did not require poetry, it required agreement and the ability to interrupt ordinary life on purpose. Then the person entered the hardest part, the part with no name that lasts. You're kneeling over a shallow trench at the edge of a rock shelter, and you're trying to find time that never wanted to be counted. Not the time of seasons, not the time of migrations, not even the time of a camp that slowly became familiar to itself. You're looking for the in-between, the moments when someone was no longer who they had been, but not yet who they would be, and the group made that pause real by returning to a particular practice again and again. Archaeology is comfortable with long spans and stubborn objects. It is less comfortable with events that were designed to vanish, and yet the ground does not only preserve what people built, it also preserves what people did briefly, carefully, and repeatedly, in ways that do not look like living. When we say there is no calendar in the dirt, we mean no one left a written sequence of steps, but sediments have their own memory. If a place is used for ordinary life, it accumulates ordinary mess, dense scatters of napping debris, varied animal bone, fragments of hearth rake out, trampling, bedding, repair, and the kind of accidental loss that happens when you're tired and hungry and you cannot keep track of every small item. If a place is used for something else, something structured and temporary, the pattern shifts. It becomes cleaner in strange ways and more intentional in others. What makes liminal time visible is not a single dramatic signature. It is the discipline of the traces and the fact that discipline appears more than once. Some of the clearest hints come from short-term use surfaces that do not develop into domestic flaws. A living flaw, even a modest one, usually shows diversity. Different tool types, different reduction stages, different food processing signals, and a mix of activities layered into one another until the surface becomes a palimpsest. In contrast, a short-term, repeated-use surface can look almost too focused. The lithics may be sparse, or they may be present in a narrow set of forms, as if only one task was allowed or needed. The faunal remains may be limited to certain body parts, or to species that do not make sense as everyday meals, and sometimes the bones are not heavily fragmented in the way marrow extraction and routine butchery often produce. The hearths themselves can be telling. Domestic hearths tend to wander as people adjust to smoke, wind and sleeping arrangements. Their ash spreads, their edges blur, rakeout accumulates, fuel choices vary. In some contexts we instead see small, controlled combustion features, rebuilt in nearly the same spot with tight boundaries and repeated layering of thin ash lenses. That is not proof of ritual by itself. People can be tidy for many reasons, but when this occurs alongside an absence of broader domestic scatter, and when it repeats through separate depositional episodes, it suggests a place visited for a narrow purpose that did not include living there. This is where microstratigraphy matters. A sequence of thin, discrete lenses with minimal mixing can indicate episodic returns separated by enough time for sediments to settle, for wind-blown dust to accumulate, or for surface crust to form. You do not need a calendar if the ground keeps returning to the same small choreography. The deeper you look, the more the smallest residues begin to act like witnesses. Geoarchaeological work and micromorphology can reveal whether a surface was repeatedly trampled by many feet over long periods, or briefly compacted in short events. Chemical signatures can indicate concentrated activity without the full suite of domestic waste. Elevated phosphates might signal the repeated presence of bodies, food handling, or organic deposition, but not necessarily the prolonged accumulation seen in long-term habitation. Microscopic charcoal and ash can show controlled burning events, sometimes with similar fuel types suggesting repeated choices. If you find multiple small hearth rebuilds separated by sterile dust, you're looking at return without settlement. This is one way stratigraphy records periodic use without domestic build-up. Another is the absence of maintenance debris. In a lived-in space you find the sweepings, the little clusters of micro-debitage pushed aside, the reworked edges where people cleared sleeping zones, the mixed refuse that ends up in shallow scoops. In an intermittently used transition space, the deposits can feel more like punctuations, a thin ash lens, a small cluster of stones arranged and then left, a few items placed and not retrieved, then quiet again. It is not that people were more spiritual there, it is that they were more constrained. The pattern suggests rules, because rules leave regularity. Unusual deposits are where the temptation to overinterpret becomes strongest, so this is where humility matters most. Archaeologists have learned, sometimes painfully, that odd can mean many things: accidents, scavengers, water transport, later disturbance, or the simple fact that we do not understand the local logic yet. Still, there are deposits that behave as if they were meant to be seen by someone. even if only once. A cache of pigment nodules placed together in a spot that is not convenient for toolmaking. A cluster of objects arranged in a way that does not follow gravity or flow. Animal parts that appear selected, not random. Stones brought from elsewhere and set in place without clear functional need. Human remains in some cases placed in locations that are hard to reach or inconsistent with accidental death. Even here, the most honest phrase is, the evidence suggests deliberation. The point is not to declare meaning, but to recognize pattern. What makes some liminal activity archaeologically plausible is that it resembles a repeated visit to an edge, not a life within it. Caves are instructive, not because caves are inherently ritual, but because deep zones can preserve soot traces from torches, footprints, and small hearths without the debris of habitation. In certain Upper Paleolithic cave contexts, the distribution of charcoal, lamp residues, and pigment marks occurs far from entrances, in places that would be impractical for sleeping or cooking. That does not tell you what was believed. It tells you that people went somewhere they did not need to go for food or warmth, and they did so with some consistency. In other settings, open-air locales can function similarly, but are harder to detect. A cleared patch reused seasonally, a riverbank return point, an outcrop visited for a specific act, and then abandoned again. The archaeological signature is not grandeur, it is repetition without domestic commitment. Transitional spaces, then, are often intermittently occupied rather than settled, and that distinction can be read in how little accumulates. A village grows thick, a camp becomes noisy in the sediment, a liminal site can remain thin and disciplined for a long time, precisely because it is not supposed to become home. The archaeology of these places is an archaeology of restraint, and restraint is visible when you compare it to the messiness of everyday life. One useful approach is spatial analysis. Habitation tends to produce overlapping activity zones, napping near a hearth, food processing nearby, sleeping areas with bedding traces, refuse tossed to the margins. A structured transitional use may produce separation, hearth in one repeated location, deposition in another, minimal overlap, sometimes a deliberate emptiness in the centre, which is not where people naturally drop things if they are simply living. Another approach is refitting and reduction sequence analysis. In domestic settings, napping produces many flakes, cores, and fragments that can sometimes be refit, showing extended reduction and multiple episodes. In some focused use contexts, you might see either very little napping or a narrow slice of the sequence, as if tools were brought in already made and taken away again, or made quickly and then removed. Again, not proof. But when this repeats and is paired with non-domestic fire use, it begins to look like a structured event rather than a household. The most unsettling part is that ambiguity itself can be a clue, because liminality is, by design, hard to categorize. It sits between the types our classification systems like to use. Not a home, not a workshop, not a midden, not a grave, and not quite nothing. Archaeologists often learn to trust absence only when absence is patterned. If you repeatedly find places with controlled burning but no cooking debris, repeated visitation but no long-term refuse, deliberate placement but minimal tool production, you're looking at a kind of negative space that may reflect social rules. The record is not saying, this is a rite of passage. The record is saying, people behaved here as if ordinary life was suspended. That is a smaller claim and a stronger one. It is also why comparative work matters. Ethnography cannot be pasted onto the Paleolithic, but it can teach you what structured in-betweenness can look like materially. Many societies create temporary spaces for transitions, shelters that are built and dismantled, places that are visited only for specific phases, fire use that is restricted, food taboos that change what gets discarded, speech rules that reduce the kind of debris we might otherwise expect. If those practices occurred in deep time, they would not necessarily leave spectacular monuments. They would leave disciplined traces and strange thinness, which is exactly what some archaeological contexts seem to preserve. You wake in the dark, and the first thing that does not happen is the thing you've always relied on. No one says your name. No one gives you the small signals that tell you what kind of person you're allowed to be today. No teasing that confirms you're still inside the circle. No routine task handed to you as if it were obvious. In ordinary life, even in the smallest band of people, identity is not an idea floating inside the skull. It is fed constantly by recognition. You are the one who carries water because someone expects your hands to reach for the vessel. You are the one who sits near that elder because people have decided you belong in that proximity. You are the one trusted with a tool because your past behaviour has made the tool safe to place in your reach. Then, during certain transitions, many societies do something that feels blunt and almost cruel in its simplicity. They remove the feeding. They create a night outside the story, where the old role is not argued with, not debated, not gently updated, but simply left unfed until it weakens on its own. We do not know what any one initiate felt in every place and century, but the comparative record is stubbornly consistent on one point. A controlled collapse of identity cues is not a side effect of transition rites. It is often the mechanism. Across a wide range of ethnographic accounts, the early days of initiation and other passages are engineered with methods that look less like celebration and more like interruption. Silence is one of the most common tools. Sometimes the novice is forbidden to speak. Sometimes others are forbidden to speak to them. In some contexts, the initiate is treated as if they cannot hear ordinary speech, or as if ordinary speech cannot reach them. Isolation is another. The person is moved away from the usual flow of life, not only away from the camp's central activity, but away from the everyday social mirrors that bounce identity back into place. The faces that greet you, the jokes that position you, the casual corrections that keep you inside the acceptable range. Sensory restriction appears again and again in different forms, from staying in darkness to covering the head, from limiting contact with ordinary food to limiting contact with ordinary objects. It is easy, from a distance, to mistake these for arbitrary hardships. But when you look closely, what they share is not suffering for its own sake. They share a deliberate reduction of cues. The old self is not killed in a poetic sense first. It is starved of confirmation until it starts to lose its structure. One of the simplest levers on the self is routine, because routine is where role hides. A daily schedule is not only a way to pass time, it is a scaffold that tells you what kind of being you are. If you do the same tasks in the same order, among the same people, with the same permissions and prohibitions, you do not have to ask who you are. The day answers it for you. Many rites of passage begin by breaking this scaffold. Meals change or vanish, sometimes through fasting or restricted diets, sometimes through eating at different times or in different places. Sleep changes, sometimes through night vigils, sometimes through waking at enforced intervals. Movement changes, sometimes by confinement, sometimes by forced travel, sometimes by being made to sit still while others move around you. The most important shift is not any one hardship, but the sudden unreliability of the familiar pattern. Modern psychology can describe this as disruption of cues and reinforcement, but the ethnographic record shows communities learned it long before anyone wrote a theory. If you remove the repetitive sequence that used to carry you through the day, you create a thin, anxious space where the brain begins to reach for a new map. The removal of social mirrors is particularly striking because it reveals something uncomfortable. Much of what we call a stable self is maintained by other people doing their part. In social theory, the idea that we see ourselves reflected in the responses of others is old, and it is not a motivational slogan. It is an observation about how humans coordinate. In small-scale societies, where survival depends on readable behaviour, this coordination is not optional. Your identity must be legible. It must be consistent enough that others can predict you during a hunt, a conflict, a migration, a crisis. When a rite strips social mirrors, it temporarily suspends that legibility and then rebuilds it under supervision. The initiate is removed from the ordinary conversation not only because secrecy is dramatic, but because conversation itself keeps the old role alive. A name spoken casually is not just a label. It is a summons to a familiar behavioural script. A joking insult from a friend is not just bonding. It is a calibration of status and permission. If those signals continue while a transition is underway, you get a dangerous intermediate state, someone who is changing but still treated as if they are not. Many societies appear to have recognised that half changes are unstable, not only for the person, but for the group. So the group becomes temporarily unavailable. It withdraws recognition on purpose, like a hand removed from a wall so the plaster can set in a new shape. This is where it is important to separate this process from punishment, even when it looks harsh from the outside. Punishment aims to reduce behaviour through pain, fear, or loss, and it often ends with a person returned to the same status, only smaller, only warned. Transition rites, in contrast, are aimed at status change. They are supposed to end with a new position that the group acknowledges as legitimate. The same tools can appear in both domains, because humans do not have an infinite menu of social techniques. Silence can punish, but silence can also reset. Exclusion can punish, but controlled seclusion can also protect a vulnerable process. The difference is not always visible in one moment, which is why the initiate can experience it as ambiguous and frightening. The difference becomes clearer when you follow the whole sequence. In many initiation systems, there are sponsors, elders, or ritual specialists whose role is not to abandon the initiate, but to manage the danger of the in-between. There are rules that constrain cruelty, even if they are imperfect. There is a timetable, a sequence, a return. Punishment often isolates someone as a warning to others. Transitional seclusion often isolates someone as a repair, for everyone's sake, because a community cannot afford a person whose old role has ended while their new role is not yet credible. Archaeology cannot usually capture the inner experience of this. It cannot hear the silence. It cannot record the way a name was withheld. But archaeology can still suggest the presence of controlled in-between spaces by what is missing and by what is oddly regular. A temporary seclusion hut may leave only a faint ring of post holes, a small hearth, and a narrow artifact signature compared with domestic structures. A restricted-use rock shelter might show repeated short-term fires and unusual deposits that do not match cooking or sleeping. A boundary zone on the outskirts of a settlement might show traces of intermittent activity without the thick domestic build-up of daily life. We do not get a label that says initiation, but we can sometimes see patterns that look like purposeful use without habitation. Even more telling, when later periods provide clearer ritual architecture, we can see how societies often designed spaces that controlled visibility, structures with limited entrances, interior chambers, corridors, screened areas, places where a person could be present but not socially present. In a world without written instruction manuals, controlling visibility is a way to control identity. If you cannot be seen as your old role, you cannot easily continue performing it. There is also a biological reason this works, and it is not mystical. Humans are unusually dependent on social belonging across the lifespan, and the pain of social disconnection is not merely metaphorical. Research in social neuroscience has shown that social exclusion reliably triggers distress and can recruit neural systems involved in pain processing, suggesting that social pain is not just a phrase but part of how the brain flags danger. We should be humble here, because modern laboratory findings are not the same as ancient life, and brains do not behave in a vacuum. Still, it helps explain why controlled isolation is such a powerful tool. If a community wants a transition to be taken seriously, it does not only need to instruct the mind, it needs to move the body into a state where the old cues lose their grip. When the group stops feeding the old self with recognition, the initiate does not simply think, "I am changing." The initiate feels it as risk. That feeling is the point. It is the pressure that makes the intermediate state real enough to obey. And it also explains why these rites can leave deep memories, even when the material traces are thin. The nervous system does not forget states that once meant survival depended on reintegration. At the same time, we should not reduce everything to fear. Many accounts describe liminal isolation not only as deprivation but as a deliberate narrowing of attention. When ordinary noise is removed, instruction becomes louder. When ordinary tasks are stripped away, a person can be made to watch, listen, memorize, endure, and learn. In some societies, initiates are treated as if they are not fully persons for a time, and that can sound dehumanizing until you understand the logic. The old person is being suspended so that a new person can be installed. It is a blunt way to handle a subtle problem. You cannot safely grant a new status if the old status is still active. You cannot ask a group to trust a new role if the evidence for that role is not yet visible. So the rite creates a vacuum, and the vacuum is carefully supervised. It is not meant to last forever. It is meant to make the old self less sticky, less automatic, less defended by habit. The old self weakens when the group stops feeding it, not because the self was fake, but because the self was partly a relationship, and relationships require maintenance. But emptiness alone is unstable, so cultures filled it with structure. A person steps forward into a new role, and everyone can see that something has changed, but no one is allowed to pretend that it changed easily, not because the world loves suffering, and not because an invisible force demands payment, but because in a small community the most dangerous thing is not transformation. It is a transformation that can be questioned. If a new status can be claimed without cost, then anyone can claim it. If anyone can claim it, the title stops being a tool and becomes a rumour, and rumours do not organise food sharing, protection, marriage or responsibility. So across many societies and across many different kinds of initiation and transition, the strange logic repeats with almost irritating consistency. Before you are allowed to be someone new, you must pass through something that makes your change socially undeniable. The point is not drama, the point is proof. Anthropologists have long noticed that rites of passage tend to contain acts that look inefficient, difficult, or even actively unpleasant. Modern eyes often rush to moral judgments. Either the ritual must be sacred and meaningful, or it must be cruel and irrational. But a third explanation sits quietly underneath both reactions, and it does not require poetry. Costly experiences can work as credibility tests. In evolutionary biology, one version of this idea is called costly signalling, and a related formulation is the handicap principle. The basic claim is simple enough to say beside a fire: A signal is more believable when it is hard to fake. If a display is cheap, anyone can perform it. If a commitment is painless, it does not separate the truly committed from the opportunists who want the benefits without the obligations. Pain, deprivation, endurance, and risk, when carefully controlled, can become a social technology. They create a barrier that filters who can or will cross it, and they create a shared certainty for those watching that the crossing was real. We do not know for certain how early this logic reaches into deep time, because ritual is not a thing that fossilizes neatly. But the evidence suggests the logic is widespread across small-scale societies, pastoral societies, horticultural societies, and state societies alike, even when their cosmologies disagree about almost everything else. That alone is a clue. It hints that the pattern is not merely cultural decoration, but an answer to recurring human problems. One of those problems is that status is invisible. A person can say, "I am an adult now," or "I am ready," or "I belong," but the group still has to decide whether to reorganize around that claim. Who gets to carry weapons? Who is trusted to watch children? Who can handle a dispute without collapsing it into violence? Who is permitted to marry into a lineage? Who is entitled to a share of scarce resources? These decisions are not abstract. They are survival math. When the stakes are that high, communities develop ways to turn an internal shift into external evidence. The ordeal becomes a kind of receipt. This is why deprivation and endurance show up so often, and why they are often structured with surprising precision. Some transitions include fasting, sleep disruption, exposure to cold, long runs, long vigils, controlled fear, complex memorization under stress, or acts of restraint when the body's asking for relief. Sometimes there is pain in the literal sense, and sometimes the pain is social, like being required to remain calm while teased, corrected, or publicly evaluated. What matters is not the aesthetic of suffering. What matters is that the experience is difficult enough that it cannot be casually replicated in daily life, and that the person cannot convincingly pretend it happened if it did not. In that sense, the ordeal is less like punishment and more like authentication. It creates a difference between someone who has been through the gate and someone who has not. And because the process is known to everyone, it makes the difference legible. There is also a second function that is easy to miss if we focus only on the initiate. The ordeal does not just test the person, it binds the witnesses. A community that watches a costly transformation together becomes invested in recognizing the outcome. If the group has supervised days of deprivation, or has maintained rules about contact and food and sleep, or has assigned elders to oversee the process, then the group has already spent resources on the change. At that point, refusing to acknowledge the new status would make the whole performance pointless. In other words, the cost is distributed. The initiate pays in discomfort, but the group pays in attention, time, and the coordination required to enforce the ritual frame. The result is not only that the new status is hard to fake, but that it is hard to ignore. The ordeal creates a shared public memory. It makes the transition something everyone can refer to later without debating whether it happened. When conflict comes, the group can say, quietly and firmly, "You crossed, we saw it, and we changed how we treated you because of it." This is also why many ordeals are designed to be witnessed, but not fully explainable in ordinary language. The community does not always need a philosophical justification. It needs a sequence that works, a repeated structure that people can trust because it has produced stable outcomes before. The initiate enters as a known role, exits as a different role, and the community recalibrates around the new expectations. If someone tries to drift back into the old pattern, the group can point to the public transformation and say, You cannot unsee what you have already paid for. That is the quiet power of enforced legitimacy. It turns a private desire into a social fact. It also helps explain why many cultures treat partial change as dangerous. A person who tries to carry old entitlements into a new role, or new freedoms into an old role, can destabilize the trust that keeps the group coordinated. The ritual cuts off that ambiguity. It says, in effect, you were one thing, now you are another, and the boundary is marked by an experience you will not easily forget. None of this requires us to romanticize hardship, and it does not require us to flatten all cultures into the same story. The variability matters. In some societies, ordeals are mild and more focused on instruction than endurance. In others, they are severe, and outside observers may recoil for good reasons. There are debates within anthropology about how to interpret particular practices and about when enforcement crosses a line into cruelty. We also have to be careful not to turn every difficult experience into costly signalling, as if one theory can explain everything. Humans do not run on a single mechanism, but even with that caution, the broad pattern remains stubborn. When communities need certainty about who is who, and when the costs of mistakes are high, they tend to create transitions that have a price. Not because pain is sacred, but because credibility is. And in a world where survival depends on coordination, credibility is not an abstract virtue. It is a structural necessity. So the ordeal, in its quiet archaeological sense, is not a performance for gods hovering above the camp. It is a performance for people living inside it. It is how a group turns a change into something that can be relied on. It is how the group protects itself from the instability of half changes, from roles that blur, from status claims that can be opportunistic, from the social vertigo of not knowing what someone will do next. The cost is paid so that doubt cannot easily undo the result. The cost was not for the gods, it was for the community's certainty. And certainty required witnesses, because private change does not stabilize a group. A person returns to the edge of camp after days or weeks away, and nobody asks how they feel, because feeling is not the evidence that matters. In the worlds we can still glimpse through anthropology and archaeology, a change in status is not complete because someone says it is complete. It becomes complete when others can see it, handle it, and recognize it without needing to hear a long explanation. That is the quiet problem with any transformation in a small group. Memory is fragile, stories drift, and doubt is contagious. If a community is going to treat you as newly something, it needs a stable cue that survives tired minds, bad weather, and the simple fact that people forget. We do not know what early Homo sapiens called these cues, if they called them anything at all, but we can observe the logic in many societies across time. Tokens, garments, pigments, and tools that function like social proof. Not proof in the courtroom sense, but proof in the camp sense, where the consequence of misunderstanding is not embarrassment, but the wrong person being trusted with the wrong task at the wrong moment. When the old person is meant to be gone, something has to take their place, and objects are unusually good at being remembered. The simplest version of this is almost disappointing. A cord that is worn only after initiation, a specific arrangement of beads, a cloak or belt that is not everyday clothing, but an announced layer, pigment applied in a pattern that is stable enough that others can read it quickly, a tool that is ordinary in function but distinguished in form, chosen materials or finishing so it becomes a marker as much as an implement. Across cultures, these things can look wildly different, but the pressure they answer is the same. A new role requires shared recognition, and shared recognition needs cues that are not entirely private. That is why so many transition markers are portable. They travel with the body they certify. In mobile or small-scale societies, a title cannot live in a building, an office, or a written record. It has to cling to skin, hang from the neck, stain the hairline, or sit in the hand. In this sense, the object does not merely represent identity, it helps identity exist socially at all. The community can now treat the person as changed without having to reopen the question each day. It is not romance, it is risk management with material culture. Archaeology, of course, arrives late to all of this, like someone trying to reconstruct an argument by examining only the footprints left after everyone went home. We never get the full choreography. What we do get are contexts. We get clusters of objects that do not fit ordinary survival tasks, placed in ways that look intentional rather than accidental. We get repeated associations between particular materials and particular activity zones. We get standardization, which is one of the most underappreciated forms of human speech. When dozens, then hundreds of similar beads appear with similar perforations, similar sizes, similar wear patterns, and similar pigments embedded in the pores, it becomes harder to argue they were made on a whim for private amusement. When ochre appears not as a smear but as carefully processed powder, stored, mixed, and transported, it begins to look less like dirt and more like a planned substance. When certain shell species travel inland far beyond their natural range, when raw materials are moved across territories, when objects show heavy polish from long use against skin rather than against hide or wood, the evidence suggests social use that persists across time. We do not need to claim we know the exact message. We only need to recognize that a message existed because the pattern is too disciplined to be random. Archaeologists talk about symbolic behavior, but in a small group, symbols are not decorations floating above life. They are tools that modify how other people treat you. One of the most revealing aspects of these objects is that many of them are stubbornly non-utilitarian, at least in the narrow sense. A bead does not cut meat. A pigment pattern does not dig tubers. A pendant does not make a fire burn hotter. And yet people invest time in them, transport them, repair them, and sometimes curate them for years. The investment itself is part of why they work as social evidence. A marker that costs nothing can be copied instantly, which means it cannot reliably communicate commitment, membership, or completion. Many societies solve this without ever articulating it as a theory. They make the sign require labour, sourcing, or endurance. A perforated shell is not impressive because it is pretty. It is impressive because it implies access, time, and patience, and because the act of wearing it is visible. The more a community depends on trust, the more useful, visible, hard-to-fake cues become. That is why ornaments and pigments often show up alongside evidence of wider networks and exchange. Portable markers travel across contact zones. They tell strangers, quickly, how to place you before conversation becomes safe. You can imagine this being especially valuable in landscapes where groups meet intermittently, where alliances and hostilities must be assessed on short notice, and where a mistake is not a social faux pas but a lethal one. Identity in that sense is not just inward stability, it is outward legibility. This is also where archaeology has to stay humble, because interpretation can easily outrun evidence. A bead may be status, or it may be a gift, or it may be grief, or it may be none of the above. A pigment may signal group membership, or it may deter insects, or it may protect skin, or it may do several things at once. A distinctive tool may be a badge, or it may simply be a good solution to a local problem. The temptation is to label everything ritual once it stops making obvious practical sense. The better approach is slower and more cautious. Look for patterns that repeat across individuals, contexts, and time. Look for association with transition moments that can be inferred indirectly, such as changes in diet, movement, or activity. Look for wear that suggests long-term display rather than short-term utility. Look for objects that cluster at the edges of daily life rather than at its centre, because transition markers often sit precisely at that boundary, not quite survival gear, not quite ornament, but something that reshapes social relations. We do not know for certain what each item meant, but the evidence suggests that meaning was stabilized by recurrence. Not every object is a symbol. But across deep time, humans repeatedly choose to make some objects carry more than their material function, and that choice is itself a trace of social engineering, because it changes behaviour in predictable ways. There is another quiet feature here that matters. Objects can do the work of broadcasting a new role without requiring speech. In small groups, speech is not always available in the way modern people assume. There are times when speaking is restricted. There are times when language is deliberately withheld. There are times when the initiate is kept silent or unnamed. There are times when outsiders are present and you do not want to explain everything. Even in ordinary life, words can be disputed, they can be misheard, they can be denied. But an object hanging from a neck, a cord tied in a known way, a pigment mark that can be seen in firelight, these are stable signals. They allow the group to behave as if the change is real, and behaviour is the point. If someone is now permitted to handle certain tools, enter certain spaces, join certain hunts, sit near certain people, or carry certain responsibilities, the group needs an external switch that everyone can recognise at once. An object can function as that switch. It does not make the person changed internally, whatever that might mean. It makes the person changed socially, which is the domain a community can actually control. You can almost hear the practicality under the symbolism. Cultures are often described as if they are built from ideas. In many cases, they are built from procedures. Once you see it that way, the line, "objects replace the old person," stops sounding mystical and starts sounding like a hard-earned technology. The old identity was not just a feeling inside the initiate. It was a set of expectations distributed across the group. It lived in other people's memory of how you used to behave, what you were allowed to do, what you were not allowed to do, where you belonged. A transition object helps rewrite that distributed memory. It gives other people permission to update their behaviour toward you. It also protects them. If something goes wrong, if the new role fails, if the person behaves strangely, the group can locate the failure in the process rather than in endless argument. The proof was given, the marker was seen, the contract was acknowledged. This is why these objects often persist after the moment. They become a public receipt, something that survives gossip and doubt, something that can be pointed to when ambiguity returns. And ambiguity always returns, because humans are humans, and even prehistoric ones were not likely to be perfectly stable creatures. The community needed a way to keep the change from dissolving back into uncertainty. But none of this guarantees the final stage. A person can be marked and still not be accepted. A token can be worn and still be challenged. A garment can be granted and still feel chujed, foreign, heavy, too new. The object may announce a transition, but it cannot force every relationship to recalibrate at the same speed. Some people will accept quickly because it benefits them to accept. Others will resist because the new status threatens old hierarchies or old comforts. And the initiate, too, may hesitate, because carrying proof is not the same as inhabiting what it proves. The object is a bridge, but bridges still require crossing. This is why reintegration is often treated as its own work, its own phase, its own fragile negotiation, rather than a simple return. The marker can say, "This has happened." It cannot automatically produce trust, intimacy, or ease. It can only make the new reality harder to deny. But even with proof, reintegration is never automatic. A person steps back into the circle of familiar faces, and somehow, that is the moment their body starts to hesitate. Leaving can be commanded. Leaving can be forced by elders, by rules, by fear, by the simple push of hands and the closing of a path behind you. But returning is different, because returning is not an action you complete alone. It is a negotiation in which every other person has to decide, quietly and in public, whether the old version of you is allowed back, or whether something new will be tolerated in its place. We do not know for certain how the earliest Homo sapiens framed this in words, or whether they framed it at all, but the comparative record across small-scale societies suggests a consistent logic. Reintegration is a social event designed to prevent ambiguity from leaking into daily life. A group can survive a temporary absence. What it struggles to survive is uncertainty about what someone is now, especially if that person will be near children, near food, near weapons, near decision-making. That is why coming back can be harder than leaving. Leaving removes a person from the system. Returning forces the system to update. This is where the quiet mechanics of rites of passage become clearer than the poetry. The classic tripartite model, separation, liminality, incorporation, is often repeated as if it describes an inner journey. In practice, incorporation is closer to an administrative act, except the administration is done with voices, bodies, and shared attention rather than documents. Public recognition completes the transformation because it signals that the group has agreed to treat the person differently from this point forward. That agreement has to be visible, not only to the initiate but to everyone else, including those who might resist. If a new status is granted in private, it can be denied later. If it is granted in public, denial becomes costly. The group is not only celebrating, it is committing. It is also protecting itself from the messy danger of half-acknowledgements, where one faction treats the person as changed and another faction treats them as unchanged. In a small group, those splits do not stay theoretical. They become conflict at the worst possible time, when a decision has to be made quickly, or when a scarce resource has to be divided, or when a dispute needs an arbitrator who's widely accepted. The ceremony, however modest it looks, is doing violence prevention. One of the most efficient tools for this kind of recognition is food, because food is a social technology long before it is cuisine. Shared meals create synchronized behavior. They pull people into the same space, the same pace, the same temporary peace. They also create obligations, because anyone who eats from a pot or from a roasting pit becomes implicated in the moment that produced it. Anthropologists often use the term commensality for this, but you do not need the word to understand the function. Eating together is a way of stitching a group back into one organism after it has been stretched. It is also a way of making the new role tangible. If the initiate is served first, served differently, or served by specific people, those microactions communicate hierarchy and acceptance more clearly than speeches. If the initiate must distribute food, that distribution becomes a public performance of the new responsibility. If gifts are exchanged, the direction and recipients of those gifts indicate where the person now sits within the web of obligations. None of this requires metaphysics. It requires only the recognition that groups run on shared expectations, and that expectations need maintenance. Archaeology, once again, cannot hear the words, but it can sometimes see the maintenance work in material traces. Large-scale feasting leaves signatures that are hard to produce accidentally. Unusually dense concentrations of animal bone, sometimes biased toward particular parts of carcasses. evidence of large hearths or roasting features used intensely in a short period, repeated episodes of burning and disposal that suggest periodic gatherings rather than everyday meals. In later periods, pottery can record this through vessel sizes and servingwares, but even without ceramics, there are clues in spatial organisation and deposition. Some hunter-gatherer sites show zones that look less like domestic scatter and more like event space, places repeatedly returned to for gatherings where consumption and display mattered. We do not know for certain whether these were initiations, funerary meals, alliance meetings, or seasonal aggregations, because the archaeological record rarely labels its own motives. But the broader point stands: groups invest in occasional collective consumption as a way to reassert structure. When reintegration is at stake, structure is exactly what they need. You can also see this logic in the way certain objects shift hands at these moments. A token does not simply sit on a body. It is given, witnessed, and therefore socially anchored. The moment of transfer is the real proof, not the object itself. The reason this matters so much is that a status change, once recognised, forces everyone else to behave differently. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the softness of celebration. If someone becomes an adult, others must treat them as accountable. If someone becomes a hunter, others must treat them as eligible for certain shares and responsible for certain risks. If someone becomes a healer, others must offer access, attention, and sometimes deference. If someone becomes a parent, others must recalibrate boundaries and expectations around care and authority. These are not abstract identities. They are modifications to the group's operating system. This is why acceptance rituals can be emotionally intense even when they are not dramatic. People are not only acknowledging the initiate, they are acknowledging that their own routine will change. Public recognition makes that change harder to avoid. It also distributes the burden. Once everyone has seen the transformation acknowledged, no single person has to be the lone supporter of the new status, vulnerable to retaliation or ridicule. The group's gaze spreads the responsibility across many eyes. This also explains why refusal to acknowledge the new role is treated as dangerous in many societies. Not because the group is sentimental, but because refusal creates ambiguity, and ambiguity invites factional conflict. If one powerful person refuses to recognize an initiate, they undermine the credibility of the ritual process itself, and that undermines future transitions. A community can tolerate many things. It struggles to tolerate a breakdown in the procedures that decide who counts as what. In some ethnographic contexts, this is why incorporation includes not only celebration but explicit statements, gestures, or prescribed forms of address. It is not that words create reality. It is that words reduce the cost of coordinating behaviour across a group. If everyone uses the same term, performs the same greeting, or follows the same rule for proximity and access, then the new identity becomes a stable fact, not an argument. In that sense, reintegration is the phase where the group chooses coherence over hesitation. It is a pragmatic decision wrapped in symbolism. If you put all of this together, the idea of rebirth becomes much less private than modern people imagine. Rebirth is not primarily an inner feeling of renewal. Feelings may come and go, and the group cannot build safety on feelings. Rebirth, in the older human sense, is a collective agreement signed in behaviour. Who sits where, who eats with whom, who can touch what, who can speak when, who is trusted in danger, who is forgiven for mistakes, who is held responsible, who is protected. The ceremony is the signing, and the daily routine that follows is the enforcement. That is why the end of liminality is not simply relief. It is also exposure, because now the initiate must live the new role under observation, and everyone else must honour it even when it is inconvenient. When it works, the group becomes more stable because its categories have been updated cleanly. When it fails, the initiate becomes a walking contradiction, and contradictions are not neutral in small groups. They attract suspicion, gossip, tests, and sometimes aggression, because unresolved ambiguity is a form of risk. And this is the darker underside that many cultures seem to understand without ever stating it as philosophy. If the group does not agree, the person is stranded. They have left the old role behind, but they have not been granted the new one. They are visible, but not placed. They are present, but not fully included. They may still be fed, still tolerated, still spoken to, but the social fabric around them becomes thin, inconsistent, full of gaps. The human mind experiences this as pain, not because it is melodramatic, but because separation from protection used to be one of the most concrete threats a person could face. So reintegration rituals do not only celebrate change, they prevent the liminal state from spreading, from becoming contagious doubt, from turning into permanent fracture. In that sense, the return is the real risk, because it forces a decision, and where agreement fails, people remain trapped between identities. Imagine this. You have been removed from your usual place by the fire. Your old name is no longer spoken in the same way, and the routines that once held you upright have been interrupted on purpose. You are not yet what you will become, but you are no longer what you were. In modern language, it is tempting to call that a phase, to make it sound gentle, like a season. But when you look across human societies, especially those that live close to risk and dependent on tight coordination, the in-between is rarely treated as romantic. It is treated as a problem that must be managed. The unsettling thing is how consistent that pattern can be. The person in transition is often described not with admiration, but with caution, not because they are evil, but because they are unclassified, and unclassified things in small groups with narrow margins can behave like sparks near dry grass. Anthropologists tried to give this its clean name. Victor Turner famously described liminality as being betwixt and between, a condition where a person is outside normal categories, temporarily stripped of ordinary status and ordinary protections. His wording became famous because it feels accurate, but it can also feel too soft, too literary, unless we remember what it implies in practical terms. Categories are not only ideas, they're instructions for how to behave towards someone. If a person is a child, there are predictable duties around them. If a person is an adult, there are predictable expectations. If a person is a healer, or a hunter, or a parent, the group knows what they're allowed to do, who can correct them, who must listen, who must share food with them first, and who may rely on them when something goes wrong. Liminality interrupts that entire operating system. The person is no longer legible, and the group is no longer sure which rules apply. The danger's not mystical at first, it is logistical. In uncertain environments, uncertainty about people is a real cost. This is why so many cultures treat liminal individuals as vulnerable. They have been separated from the old role, but not yet granted the new one, and that can mean they're temporarily outside the net of obligations that usually keeps a human alive. Protection in small-scale societies is rarely an abstract right. It is the sum of ongoing relationships, of reciprocal memory, of who owes whom and why. When a right intentionally disrupts those ties, even briefly, it can resemble social nakedness. A person can be fed less, spoken to differently, excluded from certain foods, excluded from ordinary sleep areas, watched rather than trusted. Some groups hold the initiate in a special place and provide care through designated guardians or elders precisely because the initiate has been removed from the everyday flow of protection. Others impose restrictions that make the initiate dependent and visible at the same time. Either way, the pattern is telling. The in-between is not an open meadow, it is a controlled corridor. When societies say the initiate is vulnerable, they are not always speaking in poetry. They are describing a real condition created by the ritual design. But vulnerability is only half the story. The other half is the suspicion that the unclassified person can be hazardous to others. Across cultures, liminality is often surrounded by ideas of contagion, misfortune, or disorder, even when people do not describe those things in germ theory terms. The initiate might be considered hot or unclean, not because anyone thinks dirt is immoral, but because the person has stepped outside normal boundaries and therefore cannot be trusted to behave like a normal node in the social system. A small society functions by predictability. People know who is allowed to handle certain objects, who can touch a newborn, who can approach a corpse, who can enter a ritual space, who may hunt certain animals, who may speak in council, who may share in a sacred meal. The liminal person does not fit cleanly into those permission structures, and so the easier solution is to treat them as temporarily dangerous. This is not necessarily cruelty. It is an ancient form of risk management. When you cannot classify something, you restrict it. Mary Douglas, writing about purity and pollution, argued that what societies call dirt is often matter out of place, a sign that categories have been violated. That framework becomes extremely useful here, not as a moral judgment, but as a map of how humans respond to ambiguity. The liminal person is, in a sense, a living category violation, not because they are wrong, but because they are not yet placed. The rules that maintain social order rely on boundaries. When boundaries blur, anxiety rises, and anxiety has a way of turning into regulation. People create taboos around initiates, around mourners, around new mothers, around hunters returning from dangerous work, around anyone who has crossed a line that changes their relation to the group. Sometimes the language used is spiritual, sometimes it is practical, sometimes both. But the function can remain similar. Keep the unstable state from spreading. That word spreading matters. Even without literal disease, instability can be contagious in the social sense. If one person can exist between roles for too long, it suggests that roles are not binding. If roles are not binding, obligations become uncertain. If obligations become uncertain, trust begins to thin. In groups that depend on cooperation to survive, thinning trust is not an intellectual issue. It is a physical threat. This is one reason liminality is regulated tightly in time as well as space. Many rites of passage are not only staged in special locations, they are bounded by schedules. They have a beginning that is publicly recognized, and an end that is publicly confirmed. The group is in effect saying, we will tolerate ambiguity, but only inside a fence. Because prolonged ambiguity is not just uncomfortable. It can fracture the social fabric by making everyone wonder what else is negotiable. We can see echoes of this in how communities treat those who remain in liminal states unintentionally. The widowed person before remarriage, the adolescent who refuses adult responsibilities, the exile who is not fully cast out but not fully returned, the sick person who cannot fulfill their role but cannot be replaced easily. Many societies develop special categories for these people, not because they love complexity, but because the human mind and the social system struggle to leave someone unclassified. If you cannot finish the transition, the group either forces completion, invents a new label, or pushes the person to the margins where their ambiguity does less damage. It is not pleasant, but it is coherent. The group is protecting the predictability that keeps cooperation possible. Turner observed that liminal phases often involve communitas, a flattening of ordinary hierarchy among those undergoing transition, but even that apparent freedom tends to be surrounded by strict control. The point is not liberation. The point is transformation without collapse. Archaeology cannot always see the fear language, and it cannot always see the stories told about contagion and disorder, but it can sometimes see the architecture of containment. It can see that certain spaces were used intermittently, not as homes, but as special purpose places, often separated from habitation areas. It can see repeated patterns of deposition that look deliberate, as if actions were performed under rules rather than improvised. It can see that some burials are treated differently, placed at boundaries, or accompanied by objects that suggest careful handling of a person who has crossed a line. And it can see how often transitions are marked not by individual expression, but by group choreography, by repeated sequences that look designed to keep behaviour predictable. Even when we do not know the exact meaning, the structure itself hints at the same underlying concern. Ambiguity is powerful, and power must be managed. If this sounds heavy, it is because it should. The modern habit is to treat change as a private interior event, something you go through alone, something that belongs to your feelings and your self-understanding. But in much of human history, change was rarely permitted to remain private, because private change does not stabilize a group. A person who is changing without public recognition becomes an uncertain variable. They might behave like their old role one day, and like their new role the next. They might claim permissions that the group has not granted. They might withdraw from obligations that the group still expects. The result is friction, and friction in small groups can become conflict quickly, especially under ecological stress. So the in-between becomes dangerous, not because humans are dramatic, but because humans are cooperative animals, and cooperation relies on shared expectations. Liminality suspends those expectations. It opens a gap where rules do not apply cleanly. In that gap, suspicion grows easily, not always fairly, but predictably. And that may be the quiet point that sits underneath all the ritual detail. The in-between is dangerous because it is where the social world temporarily loses its grammar. When you do not know what a person is, you do not know how to treat them. When you do not know how to treat them, you do not know what they owe you or what you owe them. And when those debts become uncertain, people become cautious, then defensive, then divided. So cultures developed ways to keep liminality short, supervised, and fenced in by rules. They didn't merely let change happen and hope everyone adjusted. They built containers around it. So cultures didn't merely allow change, they contained it. You watch a person step out of the circle of the familiar, and everyone around them begins acting as if the person they used to be has already ended, even though their heartbeat has not changed, and their hands are still the same hands. In many societies, the language of transformation does not start with improvement or growth. It starts with disappearance, not a metaphorical glow, not a private insight, but a social fact performed so firmly that it becomes difficult to argue with. If you want a community to accept a new status, you need an ending that feels absolute, and humans have always known one category that rarely negotiates: death. The odd thing is that the most common death in rites of passage is not physical. It is staged, it is rehearsed, it is narrated through removal, concealment, replacement, and sometimes the deliberate refusal to use a person's old name. We do not know how far back this logic extends in deep time, because prehistory does not preserve spoken formulas. But across comparative anthropology, the pattern is so consistent that it becomes hard to treat as cultural decoration. Symbolic death is a technology. It is one of the cleanest boundaries humans can draw, and it's drawn not to satisfy gods first, but to stabilize everyone watching. In the classical framework described by Arnold von Gennep, rites of passage move through separation, a liminal interval, and reintegration, but that structure is only the skeleton. What matters here is how groups make the first phase unambiguous. A person is removed from ordinary visibility. Daily routines stop applying. The ordinary social cues that maintain identity are interrupted. In some places, the initiate is spoken to differently, fed differently, dressed differently, or kept from speaking at all. This looks harsh to modern ears, but the underlying function is often simple. It prevents a half change. A half change is the most socially dangerous state because it forces everyone to guess. Are you still accountable in the old way, or should the rules update? May you approach the hearth, touch the tools, share food, claim a partner, speak in meetings, handle weapons, lead movement, or refuse an order? Ambiguity is expensive in small communities. It creates conflict, splits alliances, and invites quiet revenge. So many cultures do something blunt. They declare the old identity dead, not in private feeling, but in public treatment. The old role is ended by social consensus first, and only then is a new role allowed to exist. This is why death imagery returns so often even when nobody dies. Death is the clearest social boundary humans can imagine, because it is irreversible and non-negotiable. You do not bargain with it. You do not keep half of it. You do not claim it happened a little. In societies where identity is maintained by mutual recognition, an irreversible metaphor has a practical advantage. It compresses argument. It reduces loopholes. If the old person is treated as ended, then the group is not required to keep negotiating every small behaviour that now feels different. The metaphor does the heavy work. It turns gradual change, which is always messy, into a line that can be defended. The former identity is erased in ritual terms, then replaced. Some initiations include simulated burial, concealment under coverings, time spent in darkness, or deliberate dirt and ash on the body that echoes mortuary practice. Others use symbolic violence that marks an ending, a cut, a scar, a removal of hair, a change of clothing, or the destruction of an old object associated with the former status. These actions vary widely, and the meanings can be multiple, but the social effect is often the same. Once everyone has participated in the declaration of ending, the group can act as if the uncertainty has been resolved. One way to see this without romantic language is to watch what symbolic death does to legitimacy. Legitimate status is not just a claim, it is a claim that other people accept and then enforce. In many small-scale societies, status changes create new rights and obligations that affect everyone. That is why a community needs the transition to be socially undeniable. Costly ordeals help because they are hard to fake, but costly experiences alone still leave room for doubt about interpretation. Symbolic death narrows the interpretive space. It tells everyone what to do with the old identity. Treat it as ended. That instruction is powerful because it creates a shared script. Even people who dislike the change can follow the script without admitting support. They can say with the language of ritual that it is no longer their decision. The old person is gone. The new person is here. In this sense, symbolic death is not only for the initiate, it is for the group's coordination problem. It is a method for synchronizing belief and behavior so that no one has to be the first to accept the new status on their own. There is also a psychological side that can be described without reducing everything to modern therapy. Human minds are built to track social categories, anticipate behavior, and detect inconsistency. When someone changes roles, everyone around them must update predictions. That updating is uncomfortable because prediction is safety. Even in ordinary life, ambiguity makes people tense. In dangerous environments, it can be lethal. A person who is between roles, is difficult to read. Are they permitted to refuse tasks? Are they protected by the same norms? Are they still bound by the old obligations? Symbolic death resolves that by forcing a shared cognitive shift. It gives the brain a simple instruction. Stop expecting the old pattern. That clarity can reduce conflict precisely because it reduces the number of interpretations allowed. The metaphor is irreversible for a reason. Reversible metaphors invite reversible commitment. If the old identity can be retrieved at any moment, then everyone remains cautious, and the community never fully updates its expectations. Symbolic death, staged publicly, pushes the group across the threshold together, whether they feel ready or not. None of this requires a belief in an afterlife or a love of dramatic imagery. It can emerge from the practical need to manage change under pressure. Comparative ethnography shows that many societies treat the liminal person as both vulnerable and risky, and symbolic death fits that logic. If the old role is ended, then the person in transition is temporarily outside the normal moral order. They may be restricted, supervised, hidden, or handled through special rules. This can look cruel, but it also reflects a serious recognition. The person is not yet stabilized. They are not yet legible. In this unstable interval, cultures build frameworks that hold the person in place until reintegration is possible. Symbolic death is one of the strongest frameworks because it provides a narrative boundary that holds even when emotions fluctuate. You can miss the old self and still treat it as ended. You can fear the new status and still act as if it exists. Ritual, at its most functional, makes behaviour possible even when feelings are unstable. Archaeology cannot usually recover the spoken phrases that said you are dead to your old life, but it can sometimes recover patterns that make such logic plausible. Controlled transition spaces, repeated use of peripheral locations, special objects that appear in initiation contexts, and bodily modifications that create permanent evidence that something irreversible occurred. We have to be cautious here. A pigment stain is not a sentence, a bead is not a doctrine, a cut mark is not automatically ritual. But when material patterns cluster around known structural problems of transition, and when those clusters resemble what ethnography records for later societies, the inference becomes careful rather than fanciful. The deeper point is simple and slightly uncomfortable. Humans did not invent symbolic death because they were obsessed with darkness. They invented it because a clean ending is the most efficient way to make change socially final. In a world where half changes could fracture trust, the most practical invention was not inspiration. It was an ending that could not be argued with. And when real death arrived, the same machinery was already waiting. Imagine this. A small group in the half-light, hands moving carefully, not because the dead can see, but because the living can. The ground is hard, the air is cold, and nothing about their life makes room for wasted effort. Yet they spend hours, sometimes days, doing something that does not feed anyone directly. They lift a body, turn it, place it, cover it, mark it, sometimes carry it far from where death happened. If you stand over a grave in deep time, what you're really standing over is a decision. Not only the decision to keep the dead close or far, to hide them or display them, to bury them quickly or return to them later, but the decision to use death as a moment when society must speak clearly. In mobile lives, so much disappears. Fires go out, tracks vanish, camps dissolve. But a burial, even a simple one, can force a group to show what it believes a person was, and what that person has become now that they are no longer moving with everyone else. In that sense, the dead can become instructions for the survivors, not as philosophy, but as maintenance. When a role is removed from the group has to rebalance. Someone must now do what the dead once did. Someone must inherit obligations, tools, roots, relationships. The burial is where that rupture is handled, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a kind of disciplined attention that looks almost like tenderness, until you remember that tenderness and structure are not enemies. They are often the same tool, used for different problems. Archaeology does not give us thoughts, but it gives us variation, and variation is often where identity leaks into the soil. Even in the Upper Paleolithic, burials are not uniform, and that is the first clue that funerary treatment was not only about disposing of a body. Some individuals are buried alone, some in groups, some with heavy pigment, some without, some with ornaments that took weeks to produce, others with nothing that preserves. At Sungir, in what is now Russia, the burials include an adult and 2 children with astonishing quantities of worked ivory beads and carefully made objects, arranged in ways that suggest planning rather than improvisation. We do not know for certain what status those children held in life, because status in small-scale societies is not always what modern people imagine, and childhood can carry meanings we do not have words for. But the sheer labour invested, the standardisation of the beads, and the deliberate placement of objects strongly suggest that the group was marking something socially important, something they wanted everyone to recognise, perhaps even something they wanted to outlast living memory. In Central Europe, at Dolny-Vestonis, the famous triple burial of young individuals placed together invites cautious questions about relationship, event, and meaning, but also about the social work being done by the arrangement itself. The pattern is not simply that burials exist, it is that burials differ, and those differences can map onto age, sex, injury, association, or local tradition. The record is incomplete and preservation is cruelly uneven, but when we see repeated choices across regions and centuries, we begin to suspect we are looking at social differentiation expressed through ritual practice, even when no one left a text explaining it. Grave goods are where modern misunderstandings love to rush in, because it is easy to translate objects into wealth and wealth into hierarchy, and then treat deep time like a crude rehearsal for later states. But in foraging societies, objects can be signals of role, relationship and belonging without behaving like currency. A hunting implement placed with a body does not have to mean the person was rich. It can mean the person's life was remembered through competence, or that the group needed to preserve the idea of that competence after the person was gone. A cluster of shell beads can be fashion, yes, but also an identity claim in portable form, something that says this person was one of us, in this way, under these rules. At Arencandide in Italy, the burial sometimes called Il Principe includes objects and a treatment that looks unusually elaborate for its time, and scholars have debated what exactly is being communicated, because communication is clearly part of the point. Some grave goods may be tools for an afterlife in the belief system of the living, and we must allow that possibility. Some may be offerings to ancestors, or displays meant to bind the community in shared action. But even when the metaphysics are unknown, the social mechanics can still be visible. Goods placed in graves can tell the living, and anyone watching, that this person's role mattered enough to be symbolized, and that the group is willing to spend scarce time and material to make that statement durable. Then there is what you might call the choreography of a burial, the placement, pigment and attention that can turn a hole in the ground into a message. Bodies are often arranged rather than dropped. Limbs can be flexed into a deliberate posture, sometimes tightly, sometimes laid out with space around them. Faces can be oriented, stones can be positioned, ochre can be sprinkled in ways that look repeated across sites, not random. The use of red pigment in burials appears across wide spans of time and geography, including early Homo sapiens contexts in the Levant such as Kafse, and later European Upper Paleolithic burials like the famous Paviland burial in Wales, where red coloration became part of the story. We should be careful here, because pigment can enter deposits by many routes, and early excavations were not always recorded with the precision we would now demand. Still, when pigment is concentrated around the body, when it appears with other non-utilitarian treatments, when it is used in ways that suggest deliberate application, it becomes hard to avoid the conclusion that colour was doing social work. Colour can separate the dead from the ordinary world. It can mark a boundary, not only between life and death, but between categories within the dead. It can say, this person is not simply gone, this person has been processed into something else, and the group is taking responsibility for that transformation. Secondary burial takes this idea further, and it is one of the clearest ways the dead can teach the living that transformation may not end when the heart stops. Secondary burial practices can involve returning to the body after decomposition, moving bones, rearranging them, selecting certain elements, sometimes the skull, sometimes long bones, sometimes placing them together in new contexts. These practices are visible in later foraging and semi-sedentary contexts, including the Natufian of the Levant, where archaeologists have documented complex burial behaviour, including reopening graves and handling remains in ways that suggest a continuing relationship between the living and the dead. We do not know for certain whether these actions were meant to honour, control, remember, or neutralise. Often they may have done several things at once. What matters for this segment is the structural implication. Death did not always end a person's social journey. It could begin a new phase of classification. A body might first be treated as dangerous, then later as ancestral. It might first be hidden, then later displayed. It might first be mourned, then later used as a point of teaching for the young. Secondary burial is a reminder that identity can be managed across time, not only in life transitions, but in the slow administrative work of grief and social order. And this is where we need humility, because burials tempt us into overconfidence. Not everyone was buried, and not everyone was buried in ways that preserve. Some bodies were exposed, cremated, placed in water, left in places that do not fossilize the event. Some graves were destroyed by later activity. Some were excavated before modern methods, leaving gaps that will never be filled. Even when we have a burial, we cannot read it like a diary. A grave good might be a symbol of role, or it might be a gift from someone else, or a token from a ritual unrelated to daily competence. A lack of goods might reflect equality, or it might reflect haste, or the death of someone during travel, or local custom that leaves few traces. The safest statements are pattern-based. When similar treatments recur across individuals of similar age, or when unusual treatment clusters around particular categories of people, or when a community repeatedly invests labour into certain kinds of burial choreography, then we can cautiously suggest that burials encode social structure. They show us how a group stabilised itself after rupture. They show us what kinds of distinctions were worth preserving. In that sense, burials are not only about loss, they're one of the few places in prehistory where we can see order being actively rebuilt after something has been removed. So if you return to the hook, the idea that the dead were also instructions for the survivors, it begins to feel less like metaphor and more like an operational fact. A burial can teach the living who mattered, how roles were recognised, how boundaries were drawn, how categories were maintained when a person could no longer perform them. The grave is where the group can say, without speeches, this person was this kind of person, and now the group must adjust accordingly. It is a way of preventing social confusion from spreading. It is a way of telling the young what counts and telling the adults what is now required. It is a way of turning rupture into continuity, not because continuity is true, but because it is necessary. And as quiet as these scenes are, as private as a burial can feel when you imagine it under the stars, the archaeological record keeps insisting on the same point. The living were not only saying goodbye, they were also reasserting the structure that let them survive as a group. An order requires more than grief, it requires categories that endure. A person stands at the edge of their own camp, close enough to smell the smoke, far enough that no one calls them by the name they have answered to for years. Nothing about their body has changed in a way you could measure with a caliper. Their muscles are the same, their hands are the same, the world around them looks the same. Yet the moment a new name is spoken, the old one becomes strangely unusable, like a tool you're not allowed to pick up again. That is the unsettling power of names in human life. They are not just sounds, they are permissions. They are coordinates that tell others where to place you in the social world, who owes you food, who can joke with you, who can command you, who can touch you, who can ignore you. We do not know what the first human names sounded like, or even whether early groups used stable personal names in the way many societies do today. But the broader evidence from linguistics, ethnography, and the archaeology of social change suggests something durable. When a community wants a new identity to become real, it often changes what it calls you, because language is the fastest way to make the group behave as if the old person has ended. In many small-scale societies recorded by ethnographers, names function less like private labels and more like public handles that let the group lift you into a role. A name can mark kinship position, birth order, a relationship to a place, or a history of events that others recognize. It can also be dangerous. There are cultures where personal names are avoided in certain contexts, because speaking a name is treated as pulling the person into visibility, summoning obligations or stirring forces the group would rather not invite. Name avoidance after a death is one of the most revealing patterns, because it shows that a name is not merely attached to the body, it is attached to a social presence that can linger. When a name is avoided, replaced, or allowed to fade, it is not only grief management, it is social hygiene. The group is controlling what kinds of identity are allowed to stay active. That same logic appears in rites of passage. Renaming at initiation, at adulthood, at marriage, at the assumption of a new office, is a way of preventing the old role from being accidentally reactivated by habit. If people keep calling you what you were, they keep treating you as what you were. And if a role change matters for survival, for inheritance, for who is protected and who is held responsible, then allowing the old name to keep circulating is not sentimental. It is risky. This is why renaming often arrives with separation. Even when the process looks gentle from a distance, the mechanism is strict. The initiate is removed from ordinary routines, not because change needs drama, but because change needs clean boundaries. Ordinary speech is one of the strongest routines a group has. It runs without thinking. It triggers patterns of deference and teasing, patterns of sharing and exclusion. When those patterns must be interrupted, the easiest lever is language itself. A new name is a public announcement that the old expectations are no longer valid. It is also a constraint on the rest of the group. Once the community agrees to use the new label, everyone becomes responsible for the reality it creates. If you call someone child, you treat them one way. If you call them adult, you treat them another. If you call someone outsider, you narrow your generosity without ever saying so. In this sense, a name is a compact contract. It is social engineering done with breath. And it works precisely because it is so small. You do not need monuments. You do not need a written decree. You only need people to repeat the new sound until it becomes the only one that feels correct. From a scientific angle, this is also where the story becomes awkward for archaeology, because names are made of air. For most of the deep past, they leave no direct trace. Even when we find burials with extraordinary care, even when we find ornaments that signal affiliation, we do not find labels pinned to the ribcage. We do not find a word for initiate preserved in ash. Archaeology can tell us that roles existed, because roles produce pattern differences, differences in mobility, in labour stress, in diet, in burial treatment, in the distribution of prestige objects, in the way space is organised, in who is placed where and with what. But the transition from one category to another is harder to see, precisely because it is often designed to be temporary. The in-between is not meant to last long enough to build a thick domestic layer. So when archaeologists think about renaming in prehistory, the method has to be indirect. We look for moments when the social grid shifts in a way that suggests new classifications are being enforced. We look for repeated sequences, separation from habitation areas, unusual short-term activity zones, controlled fires, deposits that do not match subsistence waste, then a return to ordinary space accompanied by a different material signature. We also compare across times when writing finally appears, because once names begin to be recorded, we can see what renaming does, with brutal clarity. It anchors change in a way that can outlive the people who witnessed it. In later periods, when inscriptions and manuscripts enter the record, name change becomes visible as a formal instrument of transformation rather than a vague cultural rumour. Regnal names, throne names, religious names, initiation names, sometimes even deliberate erasures of earlier names, show the same principle. A new role is secured by controlling what the public is allowed to call you. Ancient states did not invent this mechanism, they bureaucratized it. In the early dynastic world of Egypt, for example, royal naming systems were not casual. Names were part of political reality, tied to ideology, legitimacy, and the stability of succession. In the Roman world, naming conventions mapped citizenship, lineage, and social rank, and adoption could restructure identity so thoroughly that a person's who could be rewritten in official language. In later religious traditions, taking a new name at baptism or monastic entry was not mainly about self-expression. It was about the community agreeing that the old social self had ended and a new one had begun, with new duties and new protections. Manuscripts preserved this because institutions needed memory. A small foraging band can hold identity in living relationships. A monastery, a city, a state needs identity to be portable across strangers, across years, across archives. Names become a technology for making the group's agreement travel. But the most important thing about renaming, and the part that keeps it connected to deep time even when the evidence becomes textual, is that it makes the old you harder to summon. That is not poetic. It is functional. Humans are cue-driven creatures. A name is one of the strongest cues we have. It pulls a set of expectations into the room before a person has even moved. If you want a transformation to hold, you do not only change the person, you change the cues that allow others to slip back into treating them as they were. That is why renaming is often paired with a rule that the old name must not be spoken, sometimes under threat of ridicule, sometimes under threat of exclusion, sometimes wrapped in the language of taboo. The point is not superstition for its own sake. The point is enforcement. Ambiguity is a destabilizer. The person who is half changed forces everyone to improvise, and improvisation is costly in groups that depend on predictability. So a new name compresses uncertainty. It says, Behave as if this is settled. And because the word is easy to repeat, it becomes a daily rehearsal of the new social order. There is also a quieter consequence, one that sits in the nervous system. When the group stops speaking your old name, your own sense of continuity can weaken. We do not know for certain how early humans narrated their inner experience, but cognitive science makes one modest thing plausible. The self is partly maintained by external confirmation. We stabilize our identity through social mirrors, through repeated recognition, through predictable responses to our presence. If the mirrors are removed, the mind does not simply float free into personal discovery. It often becomes anxious, vigilant, suggestible. That is why many renaming rituals are performed after a period of controlled disorientation, when the person is stripped of old cues and made receptive to a new pattern. The new name arrives like a peg hammered into shifting ground. It gives the initiate something to answer to, and it gives the group something to enforce. Even in societies without writing, this can be strong enough to restructure behaviour for the rest of a life. A name is not the whole identity, but it is the handle the community grabs when it needs to move the person into place. If you step back far enough, you can see why naming belongs in a series about death and rebirth without turning it into a metaphor. A name change is a small, controlled death. It kills a social person without killing a body. It allows the group to practice ending someone and then practice receiving someone new. And because it is done with sound, not stone, it can happen at the speed that social stability requires. Archaeology cannot usually recover the syllables, but it can recover the pressures that make syllables necessary. The need to make transitions socially final. The need to prevent half changes from leaking into daily risk management. The need to force everyone to update their expectations in the same direction at the same time. If you want to read this mechanism in the language that scholars use, Arnold van Gennep laid out the structural logic of separation and return in 1909, and Maurice Bloch's work on ritual and rebirth, including how societies create new persons through controlled breaks, is a sober companion to it. But even without the citations, the pattern is plain enough. A new name is a tool for forcing the world to treat you differently, but even names need a stage, and the stage is often the edge of fear. You're standing at the edge of a camp you have known your whole life, and the people you trust the most are suddenly the least qualified to guide you. Not because they are careless, but because they are involved. They have memories of you in your old role. They have expectations that cling like ash to clothing. They are too close to the person you were. In many societies, that is exactly why transformation is handed to someone else, an elder, an initiator, a mediator, a designated group whose job is to touch the unstable moment without being pulled into it. We do not know how far back this logic goes in deep prehistory because the soil does not preserve job titles. But the evidence from comparative anthropology and the hard limits of small group survival suggests something simple and durable. When change threatens the coherence of the group, supervision becomes a tool, not a luxury. Across a wide range of documented communities, the first move in a major transition is not only to separate the person from ordinary life, but to separate the transition itself from ordinary relationships. Arnold van Gennep wrote about rites of passage in the early 20th century, and later scholars expanded the idea. But the point is not the poetry of phases. The point is engineering. If a person is being moved from one recognized category to another, the community has a practical problem. Who decides that the old category has ended, and who has the authority to confirm the new one? If everyone can decide, then no one can. Disagreement becomes possible, and disagreement in a small group is not an abstract debate. It changes who shares food, who sleeps near whom, who can speak in certain moments, who is allowed to touch certain tools, who is trusted in danger. So many societies create a temporary structure that is stronger than everyday life. Certain people become the voice of the procedure. Certain sequences become non-negotiable. Even when the ritual looks loose from the outside, it is often tight where it matters. Permissions, prohibitions, timing, and the final public recognition. You can see why elders appear so often in this role, not as mystical figures, but as living archives. In mobile societies without permanent records, elders may be the closest thing to an external memory system, not because they are always wise, but because they have seen the consequences of ambiguity. They remember what happened the last time someone tried to return too early, or refused the final step, or kept one foot in the old status while demanding the privileges of the new. In some cases, the role is not held by age alone, but by a structured cohort. Initiation societies, age sets, or specialist lineages that handle transitions repeatedly, and therefore become skilled at managing the social volatility around them. The details vary widely across cultures, and it would be dishonest to flatten them into one universal script. But the structural pressure is familiar. Transitions are moments when the ordinary rules are insufficient, so societies invent temporary authorities that can carry the weight. If you look closely, what these keepers of the threshold actually manage is not emotion, but information. They control who knows what and when. In many initiations, knowledge is released in stages, and sometimes withheld deliberately, because premature knowledge creates premature identity. To be told the rules of the next role before the separation is complete can let a person perform change without enduring it, and performance without completion is exactly what destabilizes everyone watching. Specialists also control permissions, which in small-scale settings can mean access to the inner hearth circle, access to certain foods, access to adult tasks, access to sexual partnerships, access to decision-making. You do not need a state to have authority. You only need scarce resources, shared risk, and a group that cannot afford confusion about who is responsible for what. In that sense, supervision is not decoration added on top of change. It is one of the mechanisms that makes change socially real. This is also why authority often becomes most visible at the exact moment when people like to imagine equality. In everyday foraging life, leadership can be situational, fluid, and contested, and many hunter-gatherer groups documented in the ethnographic record show strong levelling mechanisms that discourage permanent domination. But during transitions, the same societies can tolerate, or even require, sharper hierarchy for a limited time. The reason is not that humans suddenly become authoritarian by nature. It is that transitions are high-risk events. They involve vulnerability, secrecy, altered routines, and the possibility of conflict. When normal life is running, the group can afford negotiation. When the group is trying to reassign a person's social coordinates, negotiation can fracture the process. So the community temporarily chooses clarity over debate. The specialist becomes a hinge, not the owner of power, but the holder of the sequence. And in many societies, that power is bounded by accountability. An initiator who abuses a role risks retaliation later, loss of trust, or refusal of participation. Guidance and domination can look similar from a distance, especially to outsiders, but within the small group the difference is often enforced by the same social pressures that keep everyday life relatively balanced. Archaeology, of course, has to approach this sideways. We do not excavate an elder's authority. We excavate patterned space, repeated actions, and material traces that imply coordination beyond ordinary domestic routine. A site that shows repeated non-domestic deposits in a consistent location through multiple episodes of use hints at people returning to do something formalized. A concentration of pigments, unusual wear on certain artifacts, standardized objects that are not obviously practical, or repeated hearth construction that does not fit cooking and sleeping patterns can all suggest structured events, not just living. The cautious word is suggest, because the same material traces can sometimes be produced by ordinary activities we do not fully understand. But when multiple lines of patterning point in the same direction, a picture begins to form. Not just that rituals existed, but that rituals were managed. Large-scale examples from later prehistory make the coordination visible in architecture. Monumental enclosures in the early Holocene, for instance, imply planning, role division, and repeated gatherings that could not function without organisers and rule-keepers. That does not prove initiation, but it does show something broader and important. Humans were capable of building supervised transitions into the calendar of community life long before writing and kings. There is another, quieter kind of evidence, and it lives in what stays consistent across cultures even when beliefs differ. Specialists tend to appear where ambiguity is costly. They appear in births, deaths, initiations and reconciliations, not because these moments are dramatic, but because they are structurally dangerous. A birth changes kinship and obligations immediately. A death removes a role and forces redistribution of tasks, tools and social links. An initiation grants permissions that cannot be safely half-granted. A reconciliation repairs bonds that, if left torn, can splinter a small group into fragile factions. In each case, the specialist's function is to stabilize a transition so that everyone can synchronize their behavior afterward. They're a coordination device made of human trust. They're a way of saying, this change is real, it is timed, it is witnessed, and it is complete. And once you see supervision as a form of social technology, it becomes easier to understand a strange feeling many modern people carry without knowing where it comes from. The discomfort around partial change is not just personal insecurity. In deep human terms, partial change can read as danger. Someone who claims a new status without completing the recognized steps creates uncertainty for everyone else. Are they responsible in the way the new role requires? Are they exempt from the obligations of the old role? Can they be relied on? In a small group facing predators, hunger, injury and conflict, those questions are not philosophical. They are survival math. So cultures built supervised corridors through change, with people whose job was to walk beside the initiate and hold the boundaries firm. Not to be cruel, not to be poetic, to prevent chaos. Change was supervised because unsupervised change threatened the whole system. And that supervision explains why partial change feels like a breach. Imagine this, not as a metaphor, but as a piece of engineering. A community has a person who must become someone else, and the community cannot afford to be confused about who that person is while it happens. So it builds a sequence. First you are removed, then you're held in an in-between condition, then you are returned with everyone behaving as if the previous version of you has ended. The butterfly image survives in modern speech because it is simple, but the older pattern underneath it is not poetic at all. It is administrative, in the most ancient sense of that word. It is a way to prevent identity from wobbling in public. In the early 20th century of the Common Era, Arnold van Gennep described this structure as separation, liminality and reintegration. He was not claiming every society runs the same script, and neither should we. But he noticed a recurring solution to the same recurring problem. Human groups need clean categories, and transitions threaten categories. Once you start looking at it as a solution, you stop expecting it to be gentle. Separation is not there to make the initiate feel symbolic. It solves the first problem. which is contamination of the old role. Contamination here does not have to mean microbes or superstition. It can mean something simpler. While you still share the same meals, sleep in the same place, answer to the same obligations, and receive the same everyday cues, the old identity keeps being refreshed like a fire that never quite goes out. You can decide you are changing, but your social environment continues to do what it has always done, and most of what you call a self is built from that repetition. Many rites therefore begin by cutting the cues. People are removed from ordinary speech patterns, ordinary work, ordinary food sharing, sometimes even ordinary names. In later societies we can read this in texts, and the texts are blunt about what they're doing. In monastic professions recorded in medieval Europe, for example, the novice is taken from the world, stripped of ordinary clothing, given a new habit, placed under a rule, and treated as if the previous life is no longer the operating identity. The point is not romance. It is to stop the old role from returning through habit, gossip, and default expectation. We do not know how far back this logic runs, but the evidence suggests the same constraint exists wherever roles matter. As long as the old role remains active in the eyes of others, it keeps reappearing in the body that is supposed to be leaving it. Liminality, the middle phase, is where modern audiences often drift into metaphor, because liminality feels like a mood. In the record, it looks more like a controlled holding pen for ambiguity. This phase solves a different social problem. You cannot simply erase the old role and immediately declare a new one without a period where instruction, testing, and recalibration can happen under special rules. In many ethnographic cases, the liminal person is temporarily removed from normal ranking. They may be treated as neither child nor adult, neither outsider nor full member, neither eligible for certain exchanges nor fully excluded. That ambiguity is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to be workable. It creates a time when ordinary expectations are suspended so new expectations can be installed. In some societies, the liminal period is filled with teaching, taboos, and rehearsals of responsibility. In others, it is filled with endurance, restrictions, or performances that are not art in the modern sense, but proof that a new discipline can be carried. Archaeologically, the challenge is that liminality does not look like a village. It looks like intermittent use, controlled fires, repeated placements, unusual deposits that do not accumulate as domestic debris. The point is that the middle phase can be real even when it leaves little behind. Its main product is not an object. It is a person whose behaviour has been altered under supervision. Reintegration is the phase people underestimate because it seems like the easy part. Coming back is not easy. Reintegration solves the social problem that private change does not stabilise a group. A community only benefits from transformation if everyone updates their behaviour toward the transformed person, and if the transformed person can predict how they will be treated. That requires something like a public transaction. It can be a feast, a shared meal, gifting, a formal announcement, a new seat by the hearth, a new set of permitted tasks, a new restriction. In literate societies, it may be recorded explicitly, like legal adulthood markers, marriage rites, ordinations, oaths, enrolments. In non-literate settings, it can be just as strict, because the enforcement is behavioural. This is why so many rites insist on witnesses. Witnesses are not decoration. They are the social mechanism that makes denial costly afterward. If many people saw the change being enacted, many people are now responsible for treating it as real. And if they treat it as real, the initiate can actually live inside the new category without having to argue for it every morning. When you map these phases onto the two failure modes, the pattern stops looking like a cute diagram and starts looking like a set of guardrails. If you skip separation, the old identity keeps returning, not as a spiritual lesson, but as a practical nuisance. Obligations persist, expectations persist. The same nicknames get used, the same jokes get repeated, the same small permissions are granted, and the person trying to change is pulled back into the old behavioural groove by the group's memory. In places where identity is tied to survival tasks that pull matters, an almost adult is someone you cannot fully trust with adult responsibilities. An almost initiate is someone who has not paid the cost that makes the status credible. The group is left with a person whose category is uncertain, and uncertainty is expensive. If you skip reintegration, the opposite problem appears. You can endure a middle phase, you can even be altered by it. But without the group publicly updating its rules, you remain socially unreal. You exist, of course, but not as the new role. The old role is gone, the new one is not recognised, and that is exactly the kind of prolonged liminality many societies fear. It produces someone who does not fit into predictable exchanges. Who owes what to whom? Who can marry whom? Who can hunt with whom? Who can speak in certain meetings? Who can care for whose children? These are not philosophical questions in small groups. They are logistics. What is striking, and what makes the pattern feel so stubborn across different times and places, is that each phase repairs a different form of instability. Separation breaks the inertia of the old role. Liminality provides controlled ambiguity, so new discipline can be installed without the full pressure of ordinary life. Reintegration updates the social contract so the change becomes real in other people's hands, not only in the person's private sense of self. When people talk about rebirth today, they often keep the middle part, the feeling of being in between, and they try to skip the first and last parts, because the first feels like loss, and the last feels like commitment. But the older pattern, as far as scholarship can trace it, was built precisely to force loss and commitment to happen in public. Not because humans were dramatic, but because humans were realistic about the danger of half changes. A community cannot run on internal intentions. It runs on observable roles, reliable expectations, and the ability to coordinate under pressure. So if you want the least poetic explanation for why the butterfly shape keeps reappearing, it is this. The pattern endured because it worked, even when it hurt. It produced clarity where ambiguity could fracture trust. It made status disputes harder. It reduced the social cost of uncertainty by compressing it into a managed interval. It forced the group to participate, and forced the individual to accept that identity is not only a feeling, it is a contract written into other people's behaviour. In that light, the modern obsession with private transformation can look less like progress and more like a strange experiment, a person trying to cross thresholds without threshold keepers, trying to end an identity without a clean ending, trying to begin a new one without witnesses. Not wrong, just unfinished by design. And that is why modern change feels uniquely unfinished. You're told to become someone new, but no one tells you where the door is, and no one is waiting on the other side to acknowledge you arrived. In many modern lives, transformation is demanded as a personal responsibility, while the social world stays politely indifferent, as if change is something you should complete quietly and return once you're done. We inherit a language full of reinvention and fresh starts, but we live inside systems that rarely grant clean endings. A job ends by email. A relationship dissolves into logistics. A move across borders is processed as forms, queues, and temporary permissions that can be revoked. Even becoming a parent, one of the most consequential transitions a human can undergo, can occur in a hospital corridor where the institution recognises a new legal status faster than a community recognises a new person. The mind reacts as if it has been pushed into a threshold because it has, but the architecture is missing. There is no agreed boundary the group respects, no shared pause, no public handling of ambiguity. The old role remains summonable, and sometimes it is summoned immediately, by habit, by other people, by inboxes, by bills, by the simple fact that your phone still lights up with the same expectations. What we learn from comparative anthropology is not that ritual is a colourful accessory humans once enjoyed, but that many societies treated transition as a problem of group stability first, and personal meaning second. When a role changes, a network of duties changes with it. Who can speak to whom? Who shares food with whom? Who is permitted to instruct? Who is permitted to refuse? Who is protected? Who is exposed? In small-scale settings, those rules are not written, but they are real, and a half-changed person creates contradictions that can spread. That is why, in so many documented cases, transitions were organised around witnesses and public recognition, rather than private feeling. In modern settings, the witnesses often vanish. Your changes occur alone, behind screens, between shifts, inside rented rooms where nobody has known you long enough to notice the difference. Sociologists of late modernity have described the way institutions increasingly treat persons as modular, portable units, separated from stable roles and long-term communities, and this has consequences for the psychology of becoming. It is not just that you have more freedom, it is that you have fewer collective mechanisms for making the new version of you socially undeniable. The change exists as intention and effort, but it remains socially unreal, and the body reads social unreality as danger, because for most of human history, unreality meant you might not be protected when you needed it. One reason modern change can feel haunted is that endings are no longer staged. In many contexts, there is no formal moment when the old role is declared finished in a way other people are required to honour. Even when there is legal recognition, it can be thin. A certificate can confirm a status without changing the behaviour of anyone around you. A resignation letter can end a contract while leaving your habits intact. A divorce decree can terminate a marriage while preserving the social expectations that grew around it. Scholars who study rights and social transitions often point out that the purpose of a marked ending is not simply to commemorate, but to constrain ambiguity. Without constraints, the old role persists as a default. The social world keeps addressing you as before, not out of malice, but out of cognitive economy. People rely on stable categories to reduce uncertainty, and when the world is busy, it will choose the easiest story. This is why so many modern people describe their lives as split between versions, not because they are unstable, but because the environment keeps pulling them backward. In earlier systems, the ending was protected by collective behaviour. In many modern systems, the ending is private, and privacy is not a strong shield against a world that still remembers you. This helps explain the peculiar modern experience of being stuck in a long middle. The in-between can last for years, no longer the old self in practice, not yet treated as the new self by others. Anthropologists and social theorists have used the language of liminality to describe this suspended condition, and later writers have extended the concept into contemporary settings where traditional pathways have weakened or fragmented. In some places, there is no clear boundary between adolescence and adulthood, only prolonged dependence mixed with adult responsibilities, a condition that developmental psychologists have described as an extended transitional life stage rather than a brief passage. In other places, there is no clear boundary between stable employment and unemployment, only cycles of precarious work that repeatedly dissolve identity into temporary tasks. Migration scholars describe the limbo of permits and temporary statuses that can make a person socially conditional for years, present but not fully counted. None of this requires romantic language. It is a structural pattern. People are placed into roles that lack clear public confirmation, and the resulting anxiety is interpreted as a personal deficiency rather than a predictable outcome of living inside unmarked transitions. Archaeology cannot excavate your resume or your late-night doubt, but it can teach you what a human transition looks like when it is designed to be socially real. It looks like shared attention. It looks like time set aside. It looks like controlled separation from ordinary routines, and later, controlled reinsertion with new expectations made explicit through repeated behaviour. Modernity has not eliminated all such mechanisms. Funerals still exist in many places, and they often function not only to honour the dead, but to redistribute obligations among the living, to clarify who belongs where after a rupture. Graduations, oaths, uniforms, and professional licensure can still serve as public acknowledgements that a person's role has changed and that others must respond differently. But the modern trend has been toward individualization of meaning and privatization of transformation. When a society treats change primarily as internal self-management, it saves collective effort in the short term. It also produces a population carrying unfinished thresholds in their nervous systems, people who sense that something ended but cannot point to the moment the world agreed. This is one reason the language of closure became so common. It is a request for a social service that used to be built into the way groups handled change. There is also a quiet irony in the modern obsession with authenticity. Many people believe identity change should be validated by inner certainty alone, as if the purest transformation happens without witnesses. That idea feels noble, and in private it can be true. But humans are not only private organisms. We are cooperative primates whose safety has long depended on mutual recognition. Social identity research, across decades of work, has shown how much of the self is maintained through group membership and shared norms, and how destabilizing it can feel when the social environment does not update its model of you. The distress is often interpreted morally. You are weak, you're indecisive, you're not trying hard enough. Another interpretation is simpler and harsher. You're attempting a kind of social surgery without an operating room. In many older systems, transitions were contained because the consequences of uncontrolled change were too dangerous. In modern systems, uncontrolled change is common, and we ask individuals to absorb the cost. This is not an argument to romanticize the past or to reintroduce harsh rights. It is an explanation of why modern reinvention can feel both possible and strangely unreal. Like building a bridge in fog and never seeing the far bank. So the price of becoming someone else without a ritual container is not just emotional discomfort, it is prolonged ambiguity, and ambiguity is expensive. It drains attention. It invites conflict, because different people in your life will behave as if different versions of you are real. It invites self-surveillance, because you keep checking whether the change counts yet. It invites isolation, because without communal staging you may feel you're asking too much if you want acknowledgement. And it invites a particular kind of shame, the shame of thinking you failed at something that was never designed to be completed alone. The evidence suggests that rebirth, across much of human history, was less a private breakthrough than a public recalibration. It was made real by architecture, by time, by witnesses, by structured constraint, and by a return that forced the group to behave differently. When those supports are missing, the middle can stretch. You can live there for a long time, not because you are incapable of change, but because the world has not been taught how to receive it. Rebirth is not mainly a personal act, it is a social event that used to have architecture. The butterfly was never inspiration, it was enforcement. Long before humans turned change into personal freedom, they learned that transformation requires an ending, a dangerous middle, and a return that others must agree to.